Picture this. It's 1997, and you walk into any serious hot rod shop in America. The mechanics take one look at your Ford modular engine and start laughing. They call it plastic, overcomplicated, a boat anchor. Fast forward to today, that same engine design powers everything from 700 horsepower Shelby GT500s to the most dominant NASCAR engines of the modern era. The difference? A timing discovery so simple that when builders finally figured it out, they couldn't believe Ford's engineers had left that much power on the table. The Ford modular engine family represents one of the most misunderstood success stories in automotive history. When Ford introduced these overhead cam V8s in 1991, replacing the legendary Windsor and Cleveland small blocks that had powered everything from Mustangs to F-150s for decades, the backlash was immediate and brutal. Traditional hot rodders saw the dual overhead cams, the plastic intake manifolds, the spark plugs buried deep in the cylinder heads, and they wanted nothing to do with it. One prominent engine builder called it Ford's biggest mistake since the Edsel. They were wrong. Dead wrong. And it all came down to understanding what Ford's engineers had actually built versus what they told people they'd built. To understand why the modular engine went from mockery to dominance, we need to travel back to the late 1980s. Ford was bleeding money. The company had lost $3.3 billion between 1980 and 1982. Japanese manufacturers were eating their lunch with more reliable, more efficient engines. General Motors had just launched their LT1, a modern evolution of the small block Chevy that was embarrassing Ford's ancient pushrod designs in every measurable metric. Something had to be done. Ford's solution was radical. Instead of updating their existing V8 architecture, they would design an entirely new engine family from scratch. The project, codenamed Modular, wasn't about the engines being modular in the traditional sense. It referred to the manufacturing process. Ford wanted to build inline 4s, V6, V8s, and V10s all on the same production line, using the same tooling, the same robots, the same everything. The Romeo, Michigan plant that would build these engines cost Ford $600 million to construct. That's $1.3 billion in today's money. The first modular V8, the 4.6-liter SOHC, appeared in the 1991 Lincoln Town Car. On paper, it was impressive. All aluminum construction in some variants. Single overhead cam per bank. Cross-bolted main bearing caps for bottom-end strength that rivaled race engines. Deep skirt block design that reduced noise and vibration. Chain-driven cams that would never need adjustment. The architecture was thoroughly modern, thoroughly engineered, and thoroughly different from anything Ford had built before. But here's where it gets interesting. The 4.6 two-valve made 190 horsepower. The old 5.0 Windsor it replaced, 225 horsepower. Ford was going backward. The enthusiast community erupted. Magazines ran brutal comparisons. The 4.6 was heavier than the 5.0 despite having less displacement. It was wider due to the overhead cams. It was taller, it made less power, it had less aftermarket support, and those plastic intake manifolds, they cracked if you looked at them wrong. The situation got worse when Ford introduced the 4.6 four-valve DOHC in the 1993 Lincoln Mark VIII. This engine, with 32 valves and dual overhead cams, should have been a monster. Ford's marketing claimed it was a technological tour de force. The reality? 280 horsepower from 281 cubic inches. Meanwhile, GM's traditional pushrod LT1 was making 300 horsepower from 350 cubic inches with half the valves and half the cams. The numbers didn't add up. Hot rodders trying to modify these early modular engines discovered even more problems. The combustion chambers were massive, dropping compression to a lazy 9.0.1 in most applications. The camshafts were tiny, with barely more lift than a stock Honda Civic. The intake ports were narrow and restrictive. The factory timing curves were conservative to the point of absurdity. One tuner described trying to make power with an early 4.6 as like trying to breathe through a coffee stirrer while someone's sitting on your chest. The aftermarket initially wanted nothing to do with modular engines. Edelbrock, Holley, Comp Cams, all the big names focused their development on traditional small blocks. When enthusiasts did try to hot rod modulars, they ran into architecture problems. The overhead cam design meant you couldn't just swap in a bigger cam like you could with a pushrod engine. You needed special tools, special knowledge, and special timing chains. The learning curve was vertical. But a small group of builders kept experimenting, and that's when they started noticing something odd about Ford's factory calibrations. The breakthrough came from a builder named Sean Hyland in Canada. While dyno testing a 1996 4.62 valve, he noticed something peculiar. The engine made peak power at 4,800 RPM, but the factory rev limiter didn't kick in until 6,000 RPM. Why would Ford let the engine spin 1,200 RPM past peak power? He started playing with cam timing, advancing the intake cam far beyond Ford's specifications. Suddenly, the engine woke up. Power jumped from 215 horsepower to 245 horsepower. Torque increased across the entire RPM range. The engine that everyone said couldn't breathe was suddenly inhaling like a marathon runner. Word spread through the modular community like wildfire. Other builders started experimenting. They discovered Ford had deliberately retarded the cam timing for emissions and fuel economy. The engines were essentially detuned from the factory by 15 to 20%. But here's the kicker. Unlike traditional V8s, where advancing timing might gain you power up top but kill low-end torque, the modular's 4-valve design and narrow intake ports actually benefited across the entire power band when properly timed. The 4-valve engines revealed even more potential. Builders discovered the Cobra's DOHC 4.6 had intake ports shaped like kidney beans, specifically designed to promote swirl at low RPM. When combined with proper cam timing, these ports that everyone mocked for being too small actually generated tremendous mixture motion, improving combustion efficiency beyond what traditional wedge heads could achieve. The engine that couldn't breathe was actually breathing differently, more efficiently, using port velocity and swirl instead of raw volume. Then came the real revelation. A company called Sullivan Performance started measuring piston-to-valve clearance on modified modular engines. They discovered Ford had left massive safety margins in the valve timing events. The pistons had deep valve reliefs that were barely being used. You could advance the cams 8 to 10 degrees without any mechanical interference. You could increase valve lift by 0.100 inches without touching the pistons. Ford had essentially built a race engine and tuned it like a grocery getter. The tuning revolution accelerated when SCT Performance released the first handheld programmer for modular engines in 2003. Suddenly, shade tree mechanics could adjust timing tables, fuel curves, and rev limiters without expensive dyno time. The results were staggering. Stock 2003 Mach 1s, making 305 horsepower from the factory, were putting down 335 horsepower with nothing more than a tune. No parts, no modifications, just proper calibration. But why had Ford left so much on the table? The answer involves corporate politics, emissions regulations, and warranty concerns that would make your head spin. Ford's engineers later admitted in interviews that they knew exactly what they were doing. The modular engine family had to pass emissions testing in 50 states. It had to run on 87-octane fuel despite having aluminum heads that could handle much more compression. It had to survive 100,000-mile warranties with owners who might never change the oil. It had to work at sea level and at 10,000 feet in Colorado. The conservative tuning wasn't incompetence, it was litigation prevention. There was another factor. Ford needed the modular engines to feel different from the competition. Smooth, refined, luxury-oriented. The narrow power band and soft bottom end were intentional, designed to make Lincolntown cars feel sophisticated, not sporty. The engineers built in the capability for performance, but deliberately didn't use it in most applications. As builders dove deeper into modular architecture, they discovered more hidden advantages. The deep skirt block design that added weight also added strength. While traditional 5.0 Windsor blocks would crack at 500 horsepower, stock 4.6 blocks were surviving 1,000 horsepower with boost. The cross-bolted mains that seemed like overkill for a 190 horsepower town car engine were actually strong enough for top fuel loads. The overhead cam design that everyone hated for being complex actually offered advantages pushrod engines couldn't match. Variable valve timing, introduced on the 2005 three-valve engines, was basically impossible with pushrods but simple with overhead cams. The four-valve heads flowed more air above 0.500-inch lift than any factory pushrod head ever made. The narrow bore spacing that limited displacement also reduced engine width, crucial for modern crash standards. The real validation came from professional racing. When NASCAR teams started using Ford modular architecture in the late 2000s, they discovered something incredible. The overhead cam design allowed valve angles and port shapes that were geometrically impossible with pushrods. Roush Yates Engines, Ford's NASCAR partner, was soon making 850 horsepower naturally aspirated from 358 cubic inches. That's 2.37 horsepower per cubic inch from a design everyone said couldn't breathe. The tuning discovery transformed the entire modular aftermarket. Companies that had ignored the platform suddenly rushed to develop parts. Comp cams introduced aggressive cam profiles that took advantage of the factory safety margins. Ford Racing released CNC-ported heads that flowed 300 CFM. Forced induction companies discovered the iron block versions could handle 20 psi of boost on stock internals. The 2003-2004 Terminator Cobra became the ultimate expression of awakened modular potential. Ford's SVT engineers, freed from emissions and warranty constraints, built what the modular was always capable of being. The supercharged 4.6 four-valve made 390 horsepower from the factory, but everyone knew that was conservative. With a smaller supercharger pulley and proper tune, 450 rear-wheel horsepower was guaranteed. 500 was easy. 600 was achievable with bolt-ons. The engine that couldn't compete with a traditional 350 was suddenly embarrassing big blocks. The three-valve engines introduced in 2005 incorporated lessons learned from the tuning community. Ford widened the intake port slightly. They increased compression ratios. They added variable valve timing that could be manipulated through tuning. A 2011 F-150 with the 5.0 Coyote engine made 360 horsepower and 380 lb-ft of torque while getting 23 mpg highway. The pushrod GM 5.3 in the Silverado, 315 horsepower and 18 mpg. The Coyote engine became Ford's masterpiece. Dual overhead cams, 4 valves per cylinder, variable valve timing on all 4 cams, port fuel injection and direct injection, 11.01 compression, forged pistons and rods from the factory. The first generation made 412 horsepower naturally aspirated. The current generation makes 460 horsepower. With a tune and long tube headers, 500 naturally aspirated horsepower is achievable from 5.0 liters. The same displacement as the old Windsor that made 225 horsepower. The efficiency gains were even more impressive than raw power numbers. A properly tuned modular engine could achieve stoichiometric combustion at wide-open throttle, something pushrod engines struggled with due to port design limitations. The narrow intake ports that everyone mocked generated mixture motion that improved combustion speed by 30% compared to traditional wedge chambers. This meant more complete combustion, more power from less fuel, fewer emissions. Professional builders started documenting specific improvements. A cam timing adjustment worth 30 horsepower, a tune worth another 25, long tube headers worth 20. Suddenly, a stock 260 horsepower 4.62 valve was making 330 horsepower with basic modifications. The same mods on a traditional 5.0 might have yielded 40 horsepower total. The modular engine's true capability became undeniable in forced induction applications. The 2013-2014 Shelby GT500's 5.8-liter Trinity engine made 662 horsepower with 15 psi of boost. Tuners quickly discovered it would make 750 horsepower with just a smaller pulley and tune, 800 with a cold air intake, 900 with exhaust work. The stock block, stock crank, stock rods were handling power levels that would have scattered a traditional small block across the track. Hennessy Performance took a GT500 engine to 1,000 horsepower with stock internals. They just added boost and tuning. The deep skirt block design, the cross-bolted mains, the overhead cam architecture that eliminated pushrod flex, it all combined to create an engine that could handle double its factory output without internal modifications. The aftermarket evolution was remarkable. By 2010, you could buy off-the-shelf parts to make 1,500 horsepower from a modular engine. Billet blocks, billet heads, billet cams. The platform that nobody wanted to develop for had become one of the most supported architectures in hot rodding. The knock on modular engines shifted from "they can't make power" to "they're too good at making power." The 2020 Shelby GT500 made so much power that Ford had to develop a dual-clutch transmission because manual transmissions couldn't handle the torque. The supercharged 5.2 Predator engine made 760 horsepower and 625 lb-ft of torque. With a tune and pulley, 900 horsepower was a phone call away. But here's what really validated the modular design philosophy: efficiency at power. A tuned Coyote engine making 500 naturally aspirated horsepower could still get 25 mpg on the highway. A traditional big block making the same power, you'd be lucky to see 12 mpg. The 4-valve heads, the variable valve timing, the optimized combustion chambers, they extracted more energy from every drop of fuel. The racing world took notice. Formula Drift teams started using modular engines because they could make power while staying reliable during 30-second full-throttle runs. Road racing teams loved the broad power band that VVT enabled. Drag racers discovered that modular engines with billet blocks could handle 3,000 horsepower with nitrous. The timing discovery changed everything because it revealed what Ford had actually built versus what they had released. It was like buying a Ferrari with a speed governor set to 55 mph. The capability was always there, waiting to be unlocked. Ford's engineers had future-proofed the design, building in strength and capability that wouldn't be fully utilized for decades. Modern modular engines have incorporated the lessons learned from 2 decades of tuning discoveries. The second-generation Coyote added more aggressive cam profiles from the factory. The third generation increased compression to 12.01. The Voodoo flat-plane crank engine revved to 8,250 RPM. Each generation moved closer to what tuners had been building in their shops, validating the discoveries made by weekend warriors with laptop tuners. The economic impact was substantial. The modular tuning revolution created an entire industry. SCT, Diablo Sport, Bama Performance, Lund Racing, companies worth millions emerged from discovering how to properly calibrate these engines. Thousands of shops specialized in modular performance. The platform everyone said would kill Ford performance became the foundation of a billion-dollar aftermarket. The traditional hot rod community eventually came around. The same builders who mocked plastic intake manifolds were now praising the modular's efficiency. The same magazines that ran hit pieces were featuring 1,000 horsepower Coyote builds. The overhead cam design they called overcomplicated was now recognized as superior for modern performance applications. Ford's gamble on overhead cams paid off in ways they probably never imagined. While GM stuck with pushrods, arguing about tradition and simplicity, Ford was setting track records. The Ford GT's 5.4 modular-based engine won Le Mans. The Mustang GT350R's Voodoo engine was named one of the 10 best engines in the world. The GT500's Predator engine became the most powerful factory V8 ever put in a muscle car. The story teaches us something profound about automotive engineering. Sometimes the best engine isn't the one that performs best out of the box. It's the one with the most untapped potential. Ford built an engine for the future, deliberately constraining it for the present. When enthusiasts discovered how to remove those constraints, they found an architecture capable of things no traditional V8 could match. Think about the irony. The modular engine was mocked for being weak, but it was actually too strong for its own good. It was criticized for being complex, but that complexity enabled capabilities pushrod engines couldn't dream of. It was dismissed as a mistake, but it became the foundation of Ford's performance renaissance. The timing discovery wasn't just about advancing cams or adjusting ignition. It was about understanding that modern engines are as much about calibration as construction. The difference between mediocre and magnificent might not require any new parts at all, just proper optimization of what's already there. Today, when someone builds a high-performance Ford, they don't swap in an old pushrod motor like they might have in 1997. They start with a modular engine, knowing that with proper tuning, it will embarrass traditional V8s while getting better fuel economy. The engine family that was supposed to be Ford's Edsel became their crown jewel. The modular story reminds us that innovation often faces resistance, especially when it challenges established norms. The hot rod community's initial rejection wasn't really about the engine's capability. It was about fear of change, unfamiliarity with new technology, and allegiance to tradition. Once builders understood the platform, once they discovered what Ford engineers had actually created, the mockery turned to respect, then admiration, then imitation. Every time a modern Mustang GT lines up against a Camaro SS, it's a reminder of this story. The Coyote's dual overhead cams and 32 valves square off against the Camaro's traditional pushrod V8. More often than not, the complex, supposedly inferior modular architecture comes out on top. Not because it was better from the factory, but because enthusiasts discovered its true potential and demanded Ford unlock it. The lesson extends beyond engines, beyond cars, beyond engineering. Sometimes the most mocked ideas become the most successful. Sometimes what appears to be weakness is actually untapped strength. Sometimes the future arrives before people are ready to understand it. The Ford modular engine family went from being called plastic junk to powering the fastest production Mustang ever made. All because a few builders refused to accept conventional wisdom and discovered that Ford's biggest mistake was actually their greatest masterpiece, just waiting for someone to set the timing right. What's the most underestimated engine you've ever encountered? Drop a comment and let me know your thoughts on Ford's modular gamble. Don't forget to subscribe because we're diving deep into more engineering stories that changed the automotive world.